Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome. My name is Sonia Kiner, and I'm on the network management team, Local Concepts LLC, that provides support to the Chesapeake Food Shed Network. I'm joined by network manager and Local Concepts owner, Christy Gabbard, Food Shed Network assistant, Aaron Walker, and our panelists, whom I'll introduce in a moment. We're also joined by some portion of the 90 registrants from across the U.S. We know there's tremendous experience and expertise here, and we're very excited that you joined us. First, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the CFN. The CFN is made up of individuals and organizations across the Chesapeake Food Shed who share a vision of building a sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and equitable regional food system that supports healthy communities, land, and waterways. Our mission is to catalyze the connections and collaborations necessary across the region to work towards that vision. We believe that by working together, we are better positioned to advance the pace of change. We are led by a steering team of 22 people and support 2 working groups in addition to the pilot Community Ownership Empowerment and Prosperity Action Team you'll be hearing more about today. To learn more about us and to join the network, please visit our website, chesapeakefoodshed.net. In 2016, the CFN hosted a regional food system summit and commissioned a report from Arabella Advisors to assess the landscape of the Chesapeake Food Shed. We heard resoundingly from the region that building equity and community ownership is paramount as we go about our daily and long-term food system work. Today, our 3 panelists will share more about that vision, process, and the search for leadership of this effort. After the presentations, they will answer any questions you have. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen that appears when you hover over it. Christy will be monitoring the chat box, where we'll be posting relevant links. Continue to introduce yourself and use the Q&A box for all your questions. It is an honor to introduce our panelists today. Reverend Dr. Heber Brown III is the pastor of Pleasant Hope, Pleasant Hope Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland, and the founder of the Black Church Food Security Network, an organization that helps historic African-American congregations grow food on their land and establish mutually beneficial partnerships with Black farmers in the Mid-Atlantic. Reverend Dr. Brown will set the stage today by locating the conversation first into the larger historical framework of food apartheid and food sovereignty movements. Next, Meredith Lathberry-Gerard will discuss the COEP more broadly, who has been involved, and the process to get to where we are now. Meredith is a senior program officer for the Town Creek Foundation, where she manages the foundation's Chesapeake Bay Restoration and Food System Reform programs. Meredith is also co-chair of the Washington Regional Food Funders and serves on the steering team of the Chesapeake Food Shed Network. Finally, Cara Blankner will discuss the nuts and bolts of the invitation to participate. Cara Blankner is the Health and Wellness Program Officer at the Morris and Gwendolyn Cafritz Foundation, the largest private independent foundation in the DC metropolitan area, committed to building a stronger community for residents through the support of nonprofits in arts and humanities, community services, education, health, and the environment. Cara also serves on the steering committee of the Washington Regional Food Funders and as co-chair of the Healthy Communities Working Group of the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers. Thank you so much for all of your great work. Heber, over to you.
Awesome. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's so great to be with you. I am honored to share just a little piece of this presentation, and so excited to see so many of you that I know in the chat box. I am resisting every temptation to give shout outs to everybody that I know, all my cousins and them that are in that are part of this wonderful, wonderful opportunity. I'm going to just speak for a few minutes. And really, what I really want to do is point your attention toward the link at the very top of the chat box. Is a wonderful presentation at that link on community ownership, empowerment, and prosperity, and what does that mean. Brandy Brooks and Jessica Cully did a wonderful job with a very thorough presentation around the historical groundwork for this work, not only for this work, but also the history of the food system as we know it. And that February 2017 presentation, I was jokingly telling people that, you know, you can get a college degree after going through that thing. It's wonderful. I'm not going to do that, but I just wanted to reference that for you. I'm going to share a little bit about and really try to provoke your imagination around what it means to push us toward equity as this process is inviting us into. And so let me share my screen here. Uh-oh. So many of you have seen this image, right? You've seen this image of, you know, equality versus equity. And equality means, you know, everybody gets the same box trying to look over that same fence. And equity means, you know, you provide the right number of boxes so that everybody gets a view of the game. There have been many, many articles now, and rightfully so, critiques of this imagery because as it positions and as it frames equity, it raises questions as well and props up some implications. For example, when you can talk about equity as in just adding more boxes so everybody can see over the fence, the question that I would raise is, why didn't they work together to pull up the fence? If the fence is the barrier, if the fence is that which is obstructing vision and view and full participation by everybody, then wouldn't it be something if we didn't just try to put more boxes so that more people could overcome the barrier? Wouldn't it be something if we could work in such a way that the boxes are not necessary because the fence does not exist? And I wanted to start with this image because I think it helps us to think toward, well, at least the critique helps us to think toward what it is that I believe this process is all about. Not just about adding more boxes so that more people can see over and get over the existing barriers, but rather recognizing the barriers in the current food system and working in such a way that we deconstruct those barriers. We challenge those barriers as opposed to just making it easier for more people to gain access. And so when you think about today's food system, and in fact, and I want to ask y'all in the chat box to respond. You know, I'm a Black Baptist preacher. I come from a context of call and response. And so y'all talk back at me. But today's food system, I love this quote by my good brother, Blaine Snipstall from Black Dirt Farm Collective, that the industrial food system as we know it today is the child of the plantation system of agriculture, both built upon exploited labor, dispossession, exploitation of land from indigenous peoples, destruction of rural culture and land, consolidation of power and land in the ruling classes, and the forced migration of peoples. Today's food system rests upon that framework and that foundation. And so we recognize that if that is the foundation upon which today's food system rests, then just tinkering with the system as it is will never be enough. In fact, one of my Muslim brothers, and Ramadan Mubarak to all Muslim sisters and brothers who might be joining us, but one of my Muslim brothers says, oftentimes, if your premise is wrong, then your conclusion will be wrong. And if Blaine is right, and I believe he is, in terms of the foundation of the industrial food system, if that is the premise, then any conclusions that try to keep that premise intact will have severe shortcomings and will fall woefully short in terms of addressing some of the core issues. And so instead of just making our collective oppression more palatable, we intend through this process to invite persons to bring their genius to the foreground, to challenge it at its root and at its foundation. So the shortcomings that I see in the work that I do here in the Baltimore area, and I know when I look at some of the names of people who are watching, many of you are doing tremendous work around the country, and perhaps you see some of these same shortcomings. When the language of food deserts is the primary and chief language that we're utilizing to try to understand what's happening in our food system, then our focus is always going to, point us toward access, right? The food deserts definition is about proximity to grocery stores or farmers markets and the like, proximity. And so, of course, if that's your premise, that proximity is the problem, then food access, right, is going to be your answer. Access. But access does not get to or does not go deep enough into the foundational issues that keep people feeling exploited, being exploited, dispossessed of their land, and all the other things that Blaine shared. Karen Washington, in a wonderful piece, many of you have read it in The Guardian, in her interview, but she says, what I would rather say instead of food desert is food apartheid, because food apartheid looks at the whole food system along with race, geography, faith, and economics. You say food apartheid and you get to the root cause of some of the problems around the food system. And I would hope and I believe that all of those who are on this webinar today are people who are looking to bend your genius in the direction of getting at some of the root causes of the problems of race and geography, faith, economics, et cetera, et cetera. I am of the opinion that in light of what Karen Washington shared in that quote and in that beautiful article, that systemic problems require systemic solutions. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. It is important then when I say that, what I mean is that we are not simply, and we should be inspired beyond rather nice temporary programs, that we are engaged in confrontation with a centuries-old pattern of exploitation in this country, and a program, no matter how exciting it is, by itself is not going to engage the root foundations that we're trying to confront in the system. So I often remind myself about this. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. So what is the new system? What is the better system? What is the new way? In religious or spiritual language, I would say, what is the beloved community that we're trying to lean into together? A systemic problem then is a problem, wait a minute, I'm blocked, due to issues inherent in the whole system rather than due to individual or isolated factors. And so we recognize that there are some problems in the food system as a whole. So it's not just like, hey, if we just move this one person into a position of political power, it would change everything. Or if we would just stop this one factor, then everything will be all right. We get reminded of the shortcomings of that approach when you look at this letter I found at the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, Alabama, and I was there last year. I was surprised to read in one of the archived newspaper articles there at the Civil Rights Museum that the mayor of Birmingham at that time, Mayor Arthur J. Haynes, and another person in leadership alongside him, some of you may know the name Bull Connor, Eugene Bull Connor. They were so dismayed by Black people organizing in the 60s for justice that they decided, if you look at the second paragraph of this letter, or this statement rather, they decided to cut off their contributions to the surplus food program because the Negro community was listening to, as they described it, the militant advice of the NAACP and CORE. And so the punishment to the majority Black community was to cut off its contributions to the food charity program. And that is just a historic example of how an over-reliance on programs, as well-intentioned as they are, and even food charity, an over-reliance on that for any community sets that community, or makes that community rather vulnerable to continued exploitation and oppression and domination by those in political power. Fannie Lou Hamer, one of my patron saints, then points out, in light of that letter and so many other examples throughout history, she says, food is used as a political weapon. But when you have a pig in your backyard and some vegetables in your garden, you can feed yourself and your family and nobody can push you around. Surprise, surprise, Fannie Lou Hamer said more than "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." She also had a biting critique of the food system in the country and showing the ways in which food was weaponized to aid in the imperial program of continued domination, particularly of people of color and poor people. And then this quote you've often seen as well. let me minimize my screen, about if you're coming to save. I mean, and I really want to raise this stuff again. I'm just trying to instigate the political imagination of those who would consider being a part of this. That Lila Watson shares, if you come to save us or save people of color or communities of color, you're wasting your time. There's a deeper understanding here that we can be invited into, where we recognize that our liberation is bound together, and we are in different ways bound by the same systems of imperialism and neocolonialism, and that we have to engage it in a holistic way where we recognize that even those who would position and posit themselves as saviors are actually tied up in the same system of dehumanization as well. Paulo Ferreira in Pedagogy of the Oppressed then says, no pedagogy which is truly liberating can remain distant from the oppressed by treating them as unfortunates and by presenting for their emulation models from among the oppressors. I highlighted that last line on purpose, models from among the oppressors, because I believe that it is important for any who would guide this process forward to be careful not to simply duplicate models that you've read in quote unquote best practices in publications that stem from Western thought. Please be mindful that there are models beyond the West. There are models beyond Europe. There are models beyond white conceptions and insight. There are models outside of those constructs which get all the airtime and a whole lot. Encourage everybody here, if you're not already, I know many of you already have, to check out their definition and their work around food sovereignty. Brazil's landless workers movement. These are other models beyond models that people might be most familiar with, but I just raised them. In Puerto Rico, the Organización Boricua, please check out their work around food sovereignty in Puerto Rico right now. And they've been doing this work for some years, far before Maria. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, National Farm Workers Association, United Farm Workers, and so many more models exist. And I just want to raise those names intentionally and raise these organizations intentionally so that they serve as important points of reference and perhaps points of further growth for the organizations that you are a part of, that these are, for many people, North Stars. They can serve as a compass for the work that we're doing, so that we are careful not to replicate this or strengthen and perpetuate the same systems and models of domination and oppression, but just in a kinder, gentler form. Here are examples from around the world, and there are so many more, as you know, that can be helpful in this process. And so I pray that in this this type of frame and this type of instigation of your imagination, just to consider a few things. What other examples, wisdom, or models that are germane to historically oppressed communities could be helpful in establishing guidelines? So this is just Heber speaking right now. I'm saying feel free to go off the beaten path, right? I know sometimes when we are applying for opportunities like this, or writing grants and the like, we try to find stuff that we know will get a head nod, an amen, and a point of affirmation. But I really believe that if we just recycle what we already know, then we're only gonna go so far in addressing the issues of the food in the industrial food system, and only gonna go so far in addressing real issues of equity and sovereignty in the region. Asking questions like, how does my and our privilege position me in this work? Or who are you, or who are we accountable to? Who has the power? Regularly asking the question, who has the power, has been helpful to me as I've walked into different spaces. And then also being clear about how success will be defined. These and many more questions can be helpful guides and fellow sojourners in the process of leading this, or participating, or dreaming together about how you might make your contribution to the overall move toward equity and food sovereignty in the region. That's my presentation. You're gonna get more about the process itself from my co-panelists, and I'm excited to hear from them as well. I'm gonna turn over the screen. Try to anyway at this time. There we go.
Okay. Thank you so much, Heber. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Meredith Lathbury-Gerard with the Town Creek Foundation. And let's see, hopefully I can get going here. Oop. Great. Heber, thank you so much for sharing your perspective, your wisdom, and your heart with us. I am going to give a little bit of background about the Community Ownership Empowerment and Prosperity Pilot Project, a little bit of background, who was involved and what shaped the thinking of this effort. And then I'm going to turn it over to Cara, who's going to share with you the goals of the pilot, talk about what the co-chairs will actually do and how to apply, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So this pilot project really emerged out of a conversation and a collaboration that took place over several years between the Chesapeake Food Shed Network that you heard a little bit about from Sonia, and some of the leaders with the Washington Regional Food Funders. And that is a network of about 20 or 30 systems-oriented funders that are based in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And it really grew out of a common recognition that a regional vision for the food system had the potential to drive collaboration, coordination, and innovation. And so out of that conversation, these two groups came together, these two networks came together to host the Chesapeake Region Food Systems Summit in January 2016. And that summit entailed bringing together 100 stakeholders representing sectors from across the value chain, including nonprofit organizations, community organizations, farmers, food businesses, funders, healthcare leaders, and governments leaders from Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, West Virginia, Washington, D.C., Delaware, and Virginia, all of the states in the Chesapeake watershed. And at the summit, the group of stakeholders provided a ton of input and had lots of discussion about what their priority issues were. And there was a lot of discussion about the appetite for a regional vision for the food system. And so these are the 4 priority issue areas that emerged from this summit. And these themes have also really informed the Chesapeake Food Shed Network's working groups. And these were developed through that stakeholder input that took place before, during, and after this summit. And so following the summit, a committee of partners volunteered to take all of that input and begin to design a stakeholder process for developing a regional roadmap and vision for the Chesapeake food system. And so out of a larger group of volunteers who were designing this action framework and development of this roadmap, a subgroup came together and really put a tremendous amount of thought and care and heart into the Community Ownership, Empowerment, and Prosperity pilot. And so these are the folks who were involved with that effort: Jessica Culley, Brandy Brooks, Asha Carter, Lauren Schwader-Beal, Eric Jackson, Pastor Heber Brown, Sydney Daigle, Cara Blankner, Nancy Nunn, and Patty Miller. And all of these folks provided their genius, as Heber mentioned earlier, and their intelligence and really just a tremendous amount of thought and care into developing this pilot. And I want to just note at this point, it's really important to explain that when the committee was putting together this webinar, we had a lot of discussion about who should be presenting. And we also had a lot of discussion in the committee about making sure that some of these key leaders who were involved with the committee would also have an opportunity to apply to be co-chairs or to be part of the action team. And so we needed to create a little bit of a space there so that there wasn't a conflict. And so we're really fortunate that Heber was able to present with Cara and I today, but none of the 3 of us is planning to apply for the co-chair positions. And we are also going to be putting together an advisory committee that will hopefully include some national food sovereignty leaders that will assist with the co-chair selection process. And so this is just a little bit of a visual of this action team framework that was developed for each of those topic areas that emerged out of this summit. The idea was to have an ongoing stakeholder engagement process and an iterative process that involves building capacity and leadership while helping to align and coordinate efforts across the region and leading towards integration and implementation of regional strategies. And so the outcomes that are anticipated for this particular pilot, I'm just going to share with you what the committee was thinking about for this particular pilot is, and Cara is going to delve into more detail, but to develop regional guidelines focused on equity and inclusion, and to develop prioritized strategies for fundable action. Because this is a pilot, the idea is that there will be pieces of this, hopefully, that will be replicable for some of the other food system priorities that emerged from the summit. And that all of these would be informing and influencing a regional food system roadmap. And so all of these strategies, the ideas for this iterative process to eventually be integrated into a regional roadmap that will drive collaboration, innovation, and expand the resources available for food system change. So I want to return for a moment to the four priority issues that came out of the summit, because there was a really critical inflection point in the committee's thinking that really informed and influenced the trajectory of this pilot. So I want to share with you some of the key points that the committee focused on in its development of this. One is that equity needed to be the driving force for the entire framework, not just one, it couldn't just be one singular standalone working group. That community ownership, empowerment, and prosperity also needed to be the first pilot so that the recommendations coming out of that action team would inform all of the other work. The idea being that dismantling inequity in the food system would be the underlying driver for systemic change, and that this committee very much intentionally wanted to create a process that would not reinforce or recreate existing inequities, but rather would reimagine and innovate a future food system free from systemic and institutional oppression. Another key point that the committee focused on was the process for selecting the members of the co-chairs and the members of the action team. It needed to be different from the way that the funding community typically operates, that it needed to create a range of ways for people to apply. It needed to compensate people for their participation and provide additional support such as funding for childcare and travel costs and other expenses that would make it possible for people representing historically marginalized communities to participate. And so the committee really fully integrated and embraced all of that intelligence, and all of those concepts are reflected in this invitation to participate. And so finally, quickly, I want to just talk about the funding for this project. The total budget is $115,000. We've taken a very collective approach to the funding process. So we've been engaging a lot of funding partners who are sponsoring seats that are part of this action team. And so you will see the lead partners, initial funding partners in this effort, and there are several more requests that are currently pending. So we have about $75,000 in hand, and I'm confident that the remainder of that total budget will be raised. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Cara, who's going to walk through the invitation to participate in the pilot and the RFP for the co-chairs.
As Meredith mentioned, the purpose of this particular section is really to tell you about the invitation to participate, what we hope to accomplish with the COEP initiative, what we mean actually by community ownership, empowerment, and prosperity, and then the things that we're looking for in co-chairs, the kinds of questions you're going to need to answer, and the specific instructions for how to apply, as well as some key dates and timelines. And then, of course, there's going to be a Q&A session where we hope to hear from you all, and it's really meant to be interactive, so please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A feature on your webinar platform here. Well, we're going to try to address as many questions as we can during the Q&A, but if we aren't able to get to every question, please don't hesitate to reach out to us We really would be happy to assist you with any questions that you have, and there'll be contact information at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what is community ownership, empowerment, and prosperity? For the purposes of this initiative, the Chesapeake Foodshed Network defines COEP as communities of color and other disenfranchised groups not merely being beneficiaries, but drivers of positive change in their communities. And that is a really fundamental value that we are putting forth for this effort. The goals of the initiatives are listed here, and ultimately, while we were developing this new framework for action with the committee, really what we think is that the people telling us how to invest funding and energy in our regional food system should very much be the people who are living and working on it every day. We know that our food system is broken, and we know that people of color, immigrants, people with low incomes, rural communities, and others continue to be disadvantaged when it comes to who gets the resources, who makes the decisions to shape our food system. And so we know with this initiative that future funding and policies and advocacy, that funding policies and advocacy hasn't always supported the leadership of those who are most impacted by the challenges of our food system. And ultimately, we know that this has to change. And this COEP pilot is our group's collective effort at trying to bring about some of that important change. Next slide, please. So there are two ways to participate in the COEP action team. The first, individuals or individuals representing community-based organizations can join the COEP regional action team as one of 2 co-chair positions or as one of up to 10 action team members. Ultimately, the difference between the 2 roles really is that the level of effort for participation is what's different. Co-chairs will be expected to contribute an estimated 15 to 20 hours per month for the duration of the project, which we think would be 12 to 18 months. The team members are expected to contribute roughly 6 to 8 hours a month and will be counted on to facilitate locally relevant stakeholder engagement and really serve as liaisons to their home geographies or their specific food system sectors. Collectively, the action team with the co-chair members will hopefully, according to plans, represent the diverse geographies and communities and stakeholders and economies of the Chesapeake Foodshed, because we recognize that it is a very diverse foodshed. And they will ultimately add depth and authenticity to this action team process. Right now, the invitation to participate that's out there is for co-chairs, and we plan on releasing the invitation to participate for team members in the coming weeks this summer. And ultimately that those who are applying for the co-chair positions, if you would still be interested in serving as a team member, if you for some reason are not selected as the co-chair, then there will be an opportunity for you to automatically be asked, ask us to automatically put you into the pool considered for action team members, and I'll show you where that happens later. Next slide, please. Ultimately, what we hope to achieve with the COEP is that we will have regional equity guidelines to build equity across all of our future food system reform efforts, as Meredith has mentioned already. We hope that there will also be targeted on-the-ground strategies that will speak to the specific neighborhoods or geographies or food system sectors and communities with greatest need. And that's ultimately where we hope a lot of the action team members can help bring about the intel on that and what it is that we need for that level of specificity. Ultimately, we want indicators of success so that we know what success looks like and whether or not we really are improving equity and inclusion in our food system reform efforts. And then ultimately, coordination with the Chesapeake Foodshed Network. We hope that this pilot will be connected to the regional level work and ensure collaboration and resource sharing. And then ultimately, we want prioritized strategies for action. This will be well-vetted strategies and implementation efforts that would be interesting to funders because they know that it's gone through a thorough, comprehensive process, and then ultimately will be of interest for their support. Next slide, please. What you can hope to gain from participation as a co-chair is a $15,000 stipend to support your leadership and your participation in that role, access to resources, experts and technical advisors, opportunities to collaborate on initiatives with partners and funders that you might not normally have interacted with, new connections across sectors and geographies across the region, as well as connections to national efforts and networks. Next slide, please. So the role of the co-chair is ultimately to provide thought leadership, is to sort of oversee this entire effort and lead the planning, and then ultimately work in concert with the action team members. There will be, you'll be expected to help and facilitate that stakeholder engagement piece of this pilot that will be so critical, and ultimately be responsible for the grant deliverables, and I'll get into what those deliverables are in a minute. Like I mentioned before, an expected level of effort is 15 to 20 hours per month for the duration of the project, and then we also intentionally, we staged the rollout of the two invitations to participate for either the co-chairs or the action team members. And we did this so that the co-chairs could be already selected and on board so that they can be part of that selection process for the team members that they're ultimately gonna help lead. Next slide, please. So eligible applicants include nonprofit organizations, unincorporated organizations that may have a fiscal sponsor, individuals who are representing even for-profit entities such as farmers or community organizers or consultants, and ultimately you need to be located in and your work must take place in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which you can see the geographies listed there. Next slide, please. So there are three major deliverables for this initiative that we're hoping you will sort of, you as a co-chair and with your action team members will develop along the way. The first is the development of a draft regional equity strategies and guidelines. We anticipate that this part of the process would take roughly 6 to 9 months, and the draft strategy ultimately should answer the questions of what's out there, what's getting in the way, which strategies should we pursue, and how do we know if our plan is working. Next slide, please. The second set of deliverables will be about stakeholder engagement. This includes the stakeholder engagement, we want it to answer the questions of who needs to have a say, including both proponents and opponents, or historically people viewed as opponents of food system reform. It needs to represent a diverse set of communities and sectors and economies and geographies of our food shed, and ultimately we want to know sort of what they have to say about the draft plan. This would include a thoughtful, actual written stakeholder engagement plan and then implementation of that plan. And part of, I think I may have neglected to mention on an earlier slide, part of this initiative and part of what the co-chairs will be responsible for is overseeing the budget, which is a $10,000 budget that the committee wanted to make sure was there and present to fund meaningful stakeholder engagement. So there will also be that budget for this phase, which we anticipate taking 3 to 6 months. Next slide, please. And then the last deliverable is the final regional equity strategies and guidelines. We hope that this final version is going to represent the draft version that you all collectively developed earlier on in the process, but that it has been further refined by the feedback that was gained through stakeholder engagement. And it will ultimately include the final prioritized set of regional strategies with targeted on-the-ground strategies as well that speak to some of the specific neighborhoods and geographies and food systems and sectors with greatest need. A final prioritized set of indicators of success so that we know what success will look like and whether or not we're really doing what we're setting out to do. Details about what funding is needed for implementation, as well as identifying some of the stakeholders and best advocates to help facilitate that implementation. And then ultimately a prioritized set of overarching COEP strategies to guide future work for CFN and other food system reform efforts in our region. Next slide, please. What we're looking for in a co-chair is someone or an organization with strong community relationships, a proven track record of coalition building that includes having established networks and an ability to identify leverage points for action, having demonstrated capacity for establishing effective communication channels in a coalition type governance setting. Also an ability to analyze and synthesize feedback from a series of stakeholder conversations and distill it into useful summary documents, all things that are important project management type of traits and skills that are useful and necessary for coalition building. Ultimately, we want an organization or an individual that has a commitment to equity, and we will ask you to make sure that you demonstrate how you regularly employ inclusive and systemic approaches to equity in your work, how you have sought to build capacity of the communities to act for themselves, not merely with them or on their behalf, and that you have a proven track record of respect, knowledge, and sharing and accountable relationships with historically underrepresented communities. We also want to make sure that you have an ability to serve as a bridge builder across sector and with non-traditional partners. That also includes those with opposing views. We want to make sure that you've got sufficient capacity to manage the administrative activities of this action team, and that's one of the distinguishing characteristics, I think, of a co-chair versus an action team member. Action team members won't necessarily be required to manage the administrative side of things. And then a history of working at the regional level and experience with root cause justice analysis in the food system is definitely preferred, but not necessary. Next slide, please. The CFN is really committed to supporting, promoting, and modeling diversity and equity and inclusion in all of our network activities. And so the COEP pilot is especially encouraging applicants who are people of color, from groups from underrepresented geographies throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and small-scale, relatively underfunded groups or individuals who aren't typically at the table. Next slide, please. So the application details, what you're going to need is a cover page, which includes things such as your name, your website, your organization, business and mission, the location of your work, but it will also include, and this is the point, on your cover page is where we will ask you to also indicate whether or not you want to automatically be entered into the team member applicant pool for consideration if you happen to not be selected for the co-chair position. We wanted to make it easy for you to not have to reapply and still be considered. So that on your cover letters where you will indicate whether or not you want that to happen. And then there'll be specific co-chair questions, which will include things such as, what does equity and community ownership and empowerment mean to you or to your organization? Why do you want to participate in the regional action team? What are some of the strengths that you and your organization bring to the table? As well as we'll ask you to describe some of your initial thoughts about the approach that you would take to building this work and coordinating the regional action team. Then we would require 3 to 5 references or letters of support. And ultimately, if you are representing a nonprofit organization, you'll be required to submit a letter from your leadership indicating support for staff involvement in the initiative. Next slide, please. So the application timelines. The proposals are going to be due no later than Wednesday, June 27th by close of business Eastern Time. You can submit via email to the address that's listed here. There's a subject line request. Please make sure that it says COEP submission somewhere there. If you prefer to submit the application by mail, we have an option for that too, but just note that the application must be received by the deadline, not merely postmarked by the deadline. And then we also wanted to give folks a non-written option for applying to the initiative. These are all things that we sort of developed from the committee and heard feedback as needing to be important for removing barriers to access and participation in these kinds of things. This was one of the strategies we employed, that video submissions are going to be allowed, and it does not have to be professionally produced. Cell phone videos are fine. If you plan to submit a video, it needs to be no longer than 5 minutes, and it can be something that you've already produced that represents the work of your organization, or it could be something that you create specifically for this application process. The video should help answer one or more of those co-chair application questions that I referenced earlier, and you can see in more detail in the invitation to participate. But the totality of your application, including the cover letter, a video if you choose to submit one, and then if you need to, any supplemental written narrative to cover questions that might not be addressed in the video. Ultimately, the totality of those things need to represent all the questions that were listed in the invitation to participate. And then lastly, notifications for co-chairs selection will go out in early August. And then the co-chairs are going to be asked and will be part of the review and the selection process for the action team members, which are expected to happen, the selection is expected to happen end of August, early September. And then the work for the actual CFP that will get kicked off and that you all would lead as the co-chairs is expected to begin in earnest by mid-October. Next slide, please. So that's it for the nuts and bolts of the application process and the COEP pilot. I think now I'll turn it back to my colleague, I think Sonia, for the Q&A, moderating our Q&A. And thank you for your time and for listening, for your interest, and for participating today.
Thank you so much to all three of our panelists. I want to invite all three of you back onto video if you'd like to join, or at least Dr. Brown, and thanks. So there are about a handful of questions have come in so far. A couple of them I think you answered right at the end there, but we can clarify. Someone is curious about learning a little bit more about the difference between the co-chair and the action team members. Are the co-chairs mainly organizing logistics and facilitating the process, or are they expected to have subject matter expertise as well? And I know Cara had said the co-chairs would have more administrative work. Any other pieces to expand upon there?
Sure, I can take a first stab at that, and then Meredith, please feel free to add anything that I may have forgotten. I think that the difference is going to be the level of effort. For sure, there will be more time per month contributed by co-chairs than action team members, and I think the co-chairs will sort of be convening the action team members at regular intervals in the month with facilitated conversations and pointed strategies and decision points that have to be made at each one of those convenings, but that the co-chairs would be doing work in between those convenings to kind of move the conversation and the process forward. And then also, yes, you would be responsible to the funders for the deliverables, for accounting for the spending of the stakeholder engagement dollars. And then the other thing is that because of all of those things, and that the co-chairs likely would have to have a different skill set. We want to make sure that you also have a demonstrated track record of successful coalition building and leading a large strategic planning, or leading a strategic planning process like this. It doesn't have to be a large one, but just demonstrating that you have the skill set to be successful in that kind of an initiative, because it is different than being a participant of a strategic planning process. So that's how I would characterize the difference between what we're looking for in co-chairs versus team members. The one thing for team members, I think, is action team members are really going to be our eyes and the whole level, the whole effort, eyes and ears, representing each of the specific geographies and sectors and economies, and really being a community liaison back to the ground level, and helping to facilitate stakeholder engagement at the ground level. I think that's really one thing that we will be needing from action team members, and we would assume that co-chairs would be serving in that role as well. Meredith, did I leave anything out?
Nope, sounds good, Cara.
Great, thanks.
And just to be clear, somebody wants to apply as an individual, and that's fine, correct? An independent consultant.
Absolutely, yes. That was another piece that we needed to make sure was feedback from our committee and decision points that we reached, that needed to be possible, not just a 501c3.
So are the co-chairs not actively participating in the strategic planning as participants who are generating ideas for goals, etc.?
I appreciate that question. I think our sense from this subcommittee was that it would be both, and that we really do hope that the co-chairs will be contributing in the same meaningful ways that the action team members will be, and they likely would be representing specific geographies or being a local community liaison to a specific type of agricultural economy or what have you. So we will be looking at the collective whole, both co-chairs and all of the action team members, to kind of represent the ensemble of the action team, making up a diverse set of perspectives and what have you. So it would be both and, in my opinion. I think that's what the subcommittee intended.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question from Rachel. In my understanding, food sheds are generally a smaller region. Is it feasible to chew off the entirety of the Chesapeake Bay watershed in this pilot? Has there been conversations related to perhaps North CFS and South CFS planning?
I can.
Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we've had a lot of discussion about what the right scale is certainly for the Chesapeake Food Shed Network, but also for this pilot. And the idea here is that we want to be as inclusive as possible, and there is already at least some semblance of a regional identity around Chesapeake. That being said, there's work that's concentrated in some particular areas. A lot of work is happening in the metropolitan corridor between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. in our region. At the same time, we think it's really important for there to be a high level of connectivity between those urban and suburban corridors and our rural communities. I think there's some challenges with the geographic scope. At the same time, I think it's really important that we try to work with some of the identity that we already have in the region and build upon that.
I would also add that that is the intention for this work to be happening at the regional level, but also locally and specific, especially where there are areas or communities or sectors of real need, is intentional. We wanted it to be regional. That's one of the distinguishing characteristics of this initiative, where a lot of this work has not necessarily been happening in a connected, coordinated way at the regional level, but a lot of great things happening in each of the different geographies. So that is a goal of this initiative, but we also didn't want to be so prescriptive as to figuring out and saying this is the best way to go about doing that. And that's ultimately what we will put in the hands of the co-chairs and the action team members to figure out what makes sense for their process and how they hope to see and shape this work.
Great, thank you. A question from Beth. The application asks for us to describe our support staff. Could you please tell us more about what roles you think support staff would be playing?
Sorry, I'm looking for the question. Can you repeat the question one more time, please?
The application asks for us to describe our support staff. Could you tell us more about what roles you think support staff would play?
Got you. So I think that speaks more to recognizing that those who are going to be serving in the co-chair role, there is a little more that is entailed and needing to have a bit more infrastructure to support the grant deliverables, the accounting of the spending of the stakeholder engagement dollars. So I think it really just is demonstrating your organization's or your individual capacity to be able to meet those needs is really what we would mean by support staff. And you can decide whatever support level you need, just to be able to somehow sufficiently convey that to the selection committee, that you'd be able to handle it.
Great. And someone wants to know if local, state, or federal government folks are eligible.
So, Meredith, my sense is that government entities are not eligible, that it is, but you know what, that is a question that we didn't discuss specifically. But that's my sense. We will confirm that and send it out with the follow-up materials, as well as clarify in the materials that we will post moving forward. Yeah,
it's not a question we specifically talked about in the committee, but I think it's a great question. I would say, at least, off the top of my head, I'm not sure that a government entity would necessarily meet the specific criteria for the co-chairs, but that's, there could be examples out there. So I don't think we should rule it out, but we definitely can talk about that with the committee.
Thank you for raising the question, and we'll make sure to follow up in all the ways that we can, the best ways that we can make sure to get that clarification out there.
A couple questions about the video format. Someone wants to know if it's possible to submit different videos that show your previous work of partnership and collaboration, and also if the 3 to 5 letters of reference can be sent in video form as well.
Those are great questions, and we didn't think about whether or not the letters of support could be submitted via video, but I would very much say yes. I think we want to remove as many barriers as possible. That was one of the sort of underlying principles and goals of the conversation at the subcommittee level. So yes to the letters of reference. And I would, Sonia or Christy, I would turn to you all who are going to be the recipients of the videos. And I'm assuming that yes, it can be multiple videos. Just as a limit of how many we can accept on the platform, and I don't think there is a limit. So Meredith, are you in agreement that that's the overriding principle, that we want to remove as many barriers as possible, so that yes, if you need multiple videos, then please feel free.
Yep.
Great. We just have a couple more minutes, but still a handful more questions. So if we don't get to you, we can follow up with you after the webinar. Someone asked about if you could apply for both the co-chair and the action team, and I think I heard you say that you can apply as a co-chair, and then there's a space where you can say if you don't get the co-chair role that you are interested in being on the team. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep, you'll indicate that on the cover letter. And at that point, what would happen if you indicated that you do want to be automatically considered? If for whatever reason you aren't selected as the co-chair, then yes, you will automatically be rolled over into the applicant pool for action team members without a need to resubmit.
Great. As an initiative looking to attract applicants from traditionally overlooked groups who also have a level of demonstrated leadership capacity, what thought has been put toward the goals of the effort in a climate where there is inherent inequality in professionalized sectors of food systems work?
That's a great question. And, you know, one of the things that we spent a fair bit of time on with the committee and with our additional partners was to generate a spreadsheet of community leaders and contacts who we would be distributing the RFP to. Now, you know, that has some limitations because it's all online, but at the same time, we are relying on our network of partners to really get this RFP really broadly into the community and into the hands of folks who are doing this work on a daily basis, who have not necessarily been engaged in a more formal way or with a nonprofit organization necessarily. So a number of the organizations that are in that spreadsheet are faith-based organizations, are community groups that don't necessarily have professional staff. So it's imperfect, absolutely. And we would encourage all of you on this call to please share with your networks. And if you need additional materials, either printouts or some other method of distributing the information to folks who you think would be interested, let us know and we can help you get what you need.
Great, and it is 2:30, and I do apologize for the few questions we didn't get to, but like I said, we can follow up with you after the webinar. I just want to put some final bits of information on the screen. Can everybody see that? Great. Just reminding you of the application deadline, the COEP webpage to visit, which has the invitation to participate that you can download, but which Christy also shared in the chat box. If you have any questions, you can email info@chesapeakefoodshed.net. And again, I want to say deepest thanks to our panelists today. We deeply appreciate you and the work you've done. And to all the wonderful folks who joined us today, thank you so much. And we'll be following up with a recording and related materials next week, which will also be posted on the COEP webpage. Thanks, everybody.